Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar titled More Effective Spreadsheet Controls in a New GDPR World. My name is Lucy Buckley, and I'm the Product Development Specialist here at ISACA. We have a great presentation in store for you, thanks to our sponsor, CIMCON. Before we get started, I'd like to go through a few quick tips. You have two audio options. One is to listen over your computer speakers, or two, you may dial in at any time using the numbers and codes listed to the left. Please note if you dial in, there might be a slight delay as the slides advance. All ISACA members can receive 1 CPE credit for viewing today's webinar. If you're watching the event live, you must complete 3 attendance checkpoints. Simply click OK on the pop-up that appears on your screen. Click on the Credits tab at the top of the screen to track your checkpoints. If you're watching the on-demand recorded version of this event, your progress is being tracked by the system and you must watch from the beginning to the very end. After completing this webinar, you can receive your CPE certificate by visiting the transcript page within your My Learning portal. Please remember, it will take 24 hours for the CPE credit to appear in your ISACA profile. We have made a CPE submission aid that goes over these steps in more detail. Click on the Papers tab at the top of the presentation window to learn more or to download a PDF of today's presentation. Our speakers will be conducting a Q&A session towards the end of this event, so if at any point you have a question, please click on the Q&A tab. If at any time you need technical support, please click on the Help tab. Finally, if you have a question about CPE submission process or suggestions regarding our webinar series, please visit support.isaca.org. And now I'm very excited to be introducing you to today's speakers, Craig Hattenbaugh and Dave Christensen. Craig brings over 25 years of software industry experience helping companies apply technology that enables better business results. CIMCON software is focused on helping companies reduce the inherent risk associated with end-user computing, which includes the applications not managed by IT. Dave is an information security executive and an ISO 27001 master, specializing in delivering shared CISO services to clients in the area of healthcare, financial, and ISO information security program management and risk assessment and treatment. Okay, let's get started. Craig, please take it away.
Okay. Thank you, Lucy. So just a quick overview of the agenda. We're going to speak a little bit about what EUC Risk, who owns it. We're going to talk about the intersection between information security and EUC Risk, how the two overlap and are intertwined. We're going to spend some time talking about controls and the enforcement of policy or standards that are specific to EUCs. Within the world of end-user controlled computing, which is what the acronym EUC stands for, there is a high risk of data loss in terms of sensitive data that may be controlled in those files, and we're going to talk about that risk and some of the controls that can be put in place to prevent that loss, which is typically inadvertent, but sometimes is the result of bad intent. So just as a preview, a lot of people don't pay attention to EUC Risk. Spreadsheets and other forms of end-user controlled files have been around for a long time. But, recent events show, and these events pop up from time to time on a fairly frequent basis, that when something goes wrong in a spreadsheet, if that spreadsheet is part of a critical business process, really bad things happen. In the very public case that took place in March in the UK at a publicly traded firm called Conviviality, a spreadsheet error was disclosed, and 13 days later, the CEO stepped down, and 3 weeks after that, the company went into bankruptcy proceedings. Now, that unfortunate chain of events wasn't exclusively related to an error and an issue associated with an end-user controlled file, but that was the catalyst. That was the match that started the blaze burning. And so while end-user controlled files are ubiquitous, and there's thousands, if not millions, within each of your companies. The risk comes when it's end-user controlled and it's within a critical business process. And as it relates to information security, you know, industry statistics are that 80% of a corporate's data or information is unstructured. And, you know, Excel files, access databases, and other end-user controlled applications are, you know, large areas where this type of unstructured and uncontrolled data can be found. And Dave is going to speak more to that toward the end of the presentation about some of the controls and risk mitigation steps that can be taken. So again, Excel is ubiquitous. EUCs are ubiquitous. They're in every company, and every company has this risk, some more than others. But as we spoke about earlier, the key differentiator here is these are the files and applications that aren't directly managed by IT. So whether in your firm you call it shadow IT or a user-developed application or an end-user controlled application, there's lots of different terms and acronyms that refer to it, but the key element is that it's not managed by IT and not subject to traditional IT governance and controls. Now, typically when we work with companies and they are taking proactive steps to manage their EUC risk, the focus is on models because especially in financial services industries, models have a regulatory requirement for a certain degree of governance. But tools, spreadsheets, other EUC type files can have equal risk. A lot of companies today are using robotic process automation. So companies like Blue Prism or UiPath. You know, again, this is almost compounding the risk in an EUC because you have often an application that's been configured by the business that then is automating processes across several other end-user controlled applications. So it becomes kind of a compounded risk of an end-user controlled file on top of an end-user controlled file. There are probably 25 to 30 different types of end-user controlled applications and their associated files that are on the radar, but spreadsheets by far and away are number one. Typically, they represent 2/3, if not more, of the EUC risk within a company. So if you followed the 80-20 rule and focused only on spreadsheets, you would actually address the majority of your EUC risk. And, again, because this risk is omnipresent, Excel has been around since everyone has been in business. There's kind of a complacency associated with it. People know it's dangerous, but they feel that there's not much they can do about it. And I've actually had a director of operational risk say to me that, hey, I know this is risky, but it's not a problem until it's a problem. And, implying that if something bad happens, I'll deal with it then. But, as history has shown, and in the case of conviviality that I spoke about earlier, small things can lead to very big problems. So again, when you look at spreadsheets, which are the predominant EUC out there today, the level of complexity is unprecedented. We have customers who are using spreadsheets in critical business processes that literally have millions of formulas. We're talking 2 or 3 million formulas, part of a critical process within their company. When you look at the detailed interconnections between spreadsheets and other spreadsheets, or they're doing queries against data sources, it gets messy and difficult to control very quickly. As I spoke about earlier, robotic process automation can compound this complexity. And so when you put all of that together, you have an increased probability of material errors. If the interconnected group of end-user controlled files doesn't have good information security controls, then you have further risk of data loss and the financial loss and reputational damage that comes from that. So it's somewhat easy to kind of poo-poo spreadsheets and think about them as it's a fact of life and there's nothing we can do, but it is a risk that needs serious consideration. So again, quickly reviewing some of the consequences of not having good controls and, suffering an event related to end-user controlled files. There's material errors that drive a direct and indirect loss. Sensitive data loss is quite frequent. Typically, it's inadvertent. It's done by mistake. Somebody didn't know the data was in there, or there was a hidden sheet, or there's lots of different ways this happens, but there are events in the news every day pertaining to a sensitive data loss from an end-user controlled file. If the file is part of a critical business process and it becomes unavailable due to malware or some other mistake in terms of its provision, that can have a large operational impact. Fraud happens, there are public cases, but it's rare. When we look at the risks associated with EUCs, one would think that fraud is right up there near the top, but it's really not. Errors and data loss are really the two primary risks to be concerned about. And certainly there are regulatory impact, penalties and or remediation costs if a regulator finds that the controls are insufficient. This is especially true in financial services companies that are regulated, and of course with GDPR, regardless of your industry type, if you lose sensitive information related to your customers, there are pretty steep financial consequences related to that. So again, these types of errors or data losses can have immediate consequences. Again, the case I referenced before where the CEO lost her job, I think it's safe to assume that if the CEO's job isn't safe, then your job isn't safe either, and you should take steps to address this risk. So how do EUCs relate to information security? Dave, could you chime in here and provide your perspective as an information security expert in terms of how the end-user computing world intersects with information security processes, technology, and best practice?
Yes, thanks, Craig. So EUCs pose a particularly difficult challenge, right, to the information security triad of confidentiality, right, integrity, and availability. In terms of confidentiality, right, this is, Craig alluded to it. This is where breaches occur, right? Some organizations do a better job than others at identifying these files that have sensitive information, and being that end users have control and sometimes don't have the proper awareness, they sometimes don't treat or handle them right. And so it's really important as far as confidentiality is concerned, right? You need to protect the sensitive information in the files, whether they're in the local network or in the cloud, right? You need to make sure there's proper access controls around files with sensitive information. Some technologies that can be deployed, would be DLP, for in your network, or CASB in the cloud. And then it really does come down to, right, people, process, and technology. When technology is, most times companies are really good in the technology side of things. They've got pretty good process, but the weakness tends to be in the end user and end user awareness training. So end users really need to be aware of the sensitivity of the information that they're using and copying and doing exports and those kinds of things. As far as integrity, you need to make sure there's controls to make sure that these files, especially if there's, depending on the sensitivity and importance of these files, make sure that there's, appropriate integrity, who has access, who can control, in the form of spreadsheet controls. There are some things where spreadsheets are locked down so tight where only one person can modify a cell, and so you need to be able to have those kinds of controls in place to make sure there's integrity within the data within even that spreadsheet. And then availability, always comes down to making sure that the files and unstructured data that end users quite often create and copy, there's making sure that they're available when they're needed, and then also making sure they're part of the backup and the BCP DR and guards against malware for some of the sensitive information. But it really comes down to the organization, really doing a deep dive into end user files, making sure they're classified and labeled, and end users know how to handle and treat them. But that's the area where EUCs relate to InfoSec and the particular challenges that occur with them.
Okay, great. Thanks. Let's keep going. So the good news here is, even though there are millions and millions of spreadsheets in organizations, it's a very, very small percentage that drives 80% of the risk. So you note there the average of 3,000 per employee. I recognize that sounds high, but we've been able to validate that metric across hundreds of customers, our partners at PwC and KPMG. Really, when you look at the total EUC inventory of a company, it averages that many. Now, often there might be 100 or 200 copies of the same file, but it doesn't matter. If there's sensitive information that's been copied 200 times, you're at risk 200 times. So there's millions and millions of these spreadsheets out there, but it's a very small fraction that drive 80% of the risk. So how do you start? Typically in most companies, the models are well known, and there may even be a model inventory of some form, whether it's informal or formal. But another place to look is really the typical hotspots. That would be accounting, the finance functions. Tax departments typically have a high dependence on spreadsheets because, given all the local variance and variation of tax law, they often have to resort to spreadsheets to do calculations as they roll up, financials from various geographies. HR might not be one that you would normally think of as a heavy user of spreadsheets, but we see over and over again that often HR groups will download sensitive information, do an extract or an export from an enterprise database, and get that list into Excel and start manipulating it. And then at that point, you have a high-risk EUC. So the actual figure is not 1%. We put that up there for simplicity. But if it's probably closer to 0.001%. An organization of 30,000 employees might have 100 million EUCs. In that size of an organization, of course, is very large, but there's probably no more than 2,000 that you need to keep track of. So it's a small, small number. So when you think about where does this critical 1% hide, I talked about it from an organizational perspective in terms of departments, whether they be finance, HR, or even sales operation departments. But in terms of kind of the application perspective of that, it's tools and calculators. The classic Excel use case. Financial reporting is something that we spoke about. And again, this isn't your run-of-the-mill everyday spreadsheet usage. It's when that spreadsheet usage is part of a critical business process. And a good indicator of that, it's often repeatable So on some periodic basis, whether it's a daily reconciliation or weekly or monthly or quarterly, those are the types of files that are typically indicative of being used in an important process. Data transformation is huge. It's probably one of the primary use cases of Excel. It's somewhat the poor man's ETL tool, because people do have the ability, I'm going to take data from this database and export it from that database, and I'm going to bring it into Excel and do something with it, and then feed it off into someone else. So these models, these transformation tools that may not be in the limelight, but are on the critical path of the data feed from a corporate database to the end report, those are critical. And then in terms of models themselves, sometimes those are built in Excel, sometimes they're built in scripted applications, Python, R, there's a whole laundry list of them. And then, of course, whether there's personal information, personal health information in lists or some type of register that's contained within Excel, again, that's a high-risk file that you need to pay attention to. So given that we've highlighted what EUCs are, the impact or consequences of an event, a negative event associated with those EUCs, and the types of applications and where they hide, how do you go about discovery? How do you go about putting, at least an initial reference point or stake in the ground in regards to the EUC risk within your company? So, of course, there's manual methods. At the end of the day, the line of business owns the risk. So from a risk management perspective, you can put out requirements that they identify the files in the critical business processes. Many companies maintain a manual inventory or register frequently, and then ironically enough, this often is a list that's maintained within Excel. But it's pretty basic, but at least you have an idea of what are these files, who owns them, and you have the starting point of being able to put some controls in place. So when you move on from manual methods, there are technical tools and software out there. There's scanning technology that will go out on a file share or a shared drive and actually discover EUCs. It can even, automatically risk assess and try to do some initial triage in terms of which files have the potential to be more risky than others. Again, if you're in this game of sorting from millions down to hundreds, you need some tools to do that. And then there's also various systems from a number of companies. CIMCON is one, but there are other companies as well that provide inventory management technology and so on, and it goes on from there. And another thing is, as we spoke about earlier, is just use common sense, right? You don't have to go audit the entire company. Just go look at the typical hotspots in accounting, FP&A, tax, et cetera. So once you've identified where these EUCs are, what are the challenges? The first one is getting the business to participate. We often joke that it's end user computing for a reason. Whether it's agility or control of their destiny, the business has developed these applications themselves. And they actually respond negatively to someone coming in and saying, hey, you need some controls on this. So there's kind of a cultural resistance to putting more effective controls in place. Assuming you have an inventory, keeping it accurate and up to date is the hard part. You can kind of force people or browbeat them into giving you the initial list, but trying to keep that current is really, really difficult. Often, determining what's an important or a critical EUC is very subjective. You see it all the times in companies trying to decide what's a model, what isn't, what needs more comprehensive controls, what doesn't. And that type of subjectivity makes it difficult when it comes to auditing and really understanding, have we identified all the critical files? And then, of course, this ties back to the first bullet point about resistance from the line of business that's actually using these files. You're trying to minimize the burden of any manual process. You know, if you go to them and give them a long list of documentation requirements, it's going to be tough to get their compliance and cooperation. When we think about automation, again, I won't spend too much time on this. Again, there are software tools that will help automate the application of the controls, the measurement and analytics around the enforcement and compliance levels. We spoke about the network drive scanning technology to go out and discover. This technology can look at millions of files in an hour. There's inventory management, and again, automating the process of keeping it current and up to date by sending reminder emails. You know, high-risk files are typically looked at on a quarterly or a semi-annual basis. Sending out those reminders, making sure that it gets done is important. Change management, implementation of basic controls like access and versioning or more advanced controls can be facilitated with technology. And then there's finally the workflow and approval processes. So to the extent you have a risk management process in place, you can use technology and software to automate that, make sure that it happens, and measure the results. Again, when we're talking about EUCs, one of the things that is daunting about it is the vast number of them. And even though you may distill a population of tens of millions of files down to, you know, 100 or several hundred that you're interested in controlling, that's still a very large task when you think of trying to keep track of compliance and understand, you know, if the policy and procedure and standards are being adhered to. It's difficult to do, even if you're down to the hundreds. So things that can be done to solve that. The concept of having an audit trail that's continuous 24/7, keeping track of all changes. You can keep track of changes at the file level. So for example, what user accessed this file? What date did they access it? What change did they make? You can keep track of things down to a cell level. Someone went into cell B16 and changed a formula from X to Y. A big challenge in managing EUC risk is the frequency and propensity to make multiple copies of the same files. So being able to track every copy made by a unique identifier and keeping track of that parent-child lineage is important. Keeping records of reviews and approvals when you have a process that requires a second or a third set of eyes. You know, being able to keep track of that and have a record is important when you're dealing with a large number of these files. You know, in smaller companies, your critical files may be only 10 or 12, and you can certainly do that manually, and you don't have to worry about, you know, automation or tools to do that at scale. But the process that you go through in terms of reviews and just having someone check and having awareness of what critical processes are dependent on these is the same, and it's important. So in terms of the cloud, you know, frequently I think the prevailing, I don't know if wisdom is the right word, but I think intuitively people feel that if my files are in the cloud, you know, are they at a higher level of risk? And so in particular, when we're thinking of EUCs and, you know, Office 365 files or Access databases, you know, is that risk higher in the cloud? And in our opinion, and this is, as the slide says, it's an opinion of CIMCON, you know, your EUC risk is actually lower when you go to the cloud. Just consolidating these files in a single place actually makes progress toward lowering your risk. Even if you don't go any further or apply any advanced controls, just knowing here's the folder or group of folders in which our critical files are located, you can take some very simple steps to increase the information security, and it makes it much easier to monitor the processes assigned with protecting that information. The cloud platforms themselves, so whether you use an enterprise content management platform like Box or Dropbox, or you're keeping your files in Office 365, there are native controls at the file level. They typically don't go to the cell level, so you can't implement a cell level control from those platforms, but certainly file level controls, access, versioning, automated backup, all of that comes, for the tick of admission onto a public cloud platform. From an IT infrastructure standpoint, those platforms are very, very reliable in terms of their availability and the degree to which the uptime is maintained. They have built-in flexibility in terms of geographic location. So if your country has a restriction on data not being able to leave, you can pick where it's stored and be compliant with local regulations. The one caution that we would make is, there's always a catch, and if you choose to migrate files to the cloud, particularly spreadsheets, if that spreadsheet has links to other spreadsheets, those links will break. So there is a degree of work when migrating legacy files to the cloud, but the work to get those fixed, and you only have to fix it once, is often worth the benefits that are gained from moving to the cloud. So we've talked about inventories. You need a standard. Again, millions of files. How do you distill that down to the ones that need monitoring? What should go into your inventory? The high-level criticality, materiality assessment. Is this part of a business process? Is it complex and thus more prone to error? We spoke again before about the subjectivity around criticality. One thing is to use quantitative methods of, is there macro code, yes or no? What is the number of other spreadsheets this is interconnected to? So by setting your standards that, a file that's connected to, that has macro code is used in financial reporting and is connected to 3 other databases, that can be an objective threshold for determining criticality and what should go into your inventory. Again, moving back toward the information security aspect of this, data loss is common. These are all public cases here, so this is nothing proprietary on this slide. In the Boeing case, an employee at Boeing emailed a file outside the firewall asking a spouse for help, and ultimately that data ended up getting into the public domain, the sensitive data. The spreadsheet on the lower left is actually still on the web today, 4 years after the breach at Sony Pictures. It's an Excel file that was hacked and put up on the public domain containing passwords of all their servers. And of course, a few years back, the hack of the Democratic National Committee, where there was a spreadsheet called the list of big things, and it had all the donors and the money they had given, and that file had been stolen. So, data loss from EUCs is common. It's typically inadvertent, but malware and people with criminal intent certainly contribute to the risk. EUCs often slip through the crack, and I'll ask Dave to comment here when I'm through, but larger organizations typically have a labeling and classification policy, but small to medium businesses don't. Another area that often creates a vulnerability is when people take data from a secure enterprise system and bring that down into an end-user controlled file. And then, of course, the continuous copying, which is kind of the nature of what happens with end-user files, can create issues as well. Dave, I don't know if you want to comment on that in terms of your experience of classification and user awareness in the small to medium-sized businesses?
For sure, yeah. So it is, right? We've got all kinds of technology that can be put in place. This process that can be put in place, but it really comes down to the people, and the people that create the files and use the files, making sure that they're aware, right? And so that Craig alluded to the cloud, right? And the risk of files in the cloud being lower. Well, why is that, right? The reason is that in the cloud, quite often, they have controls in place that when you create a file, it'll ask you to classify it. And so it goes in, the end user is part of the classification process. And so it's really important to make sure that end users understand, the organization's classification and labeling and handling of information. And so, and that's why the opinion is that in the cloud, there is less risk because the controls can be put in place that when you create a file, it prompts the user, what is the sensitivity of this information? What is it? How should it be classified? And so from the creation of that file being stored, you can then begin to manage the life of that file. All right. Quite often on your network, it's a more of a challenge, right? But in today's cloud platform, it's built right in, right? And so really it comes down to end user awareness and making sure they understand what they're doing when they're copying an Excel spreadsheet of sensitive information from just making copies of it and sharing it. It really does, it's the people part of things, okay? And making sure that people are aware. There's plenty of technology out there, but it really does, the weakest link, in that chain of people, process, and technology is the people part. And so the beauty of the people part is if you spend the time to train them, then they become part of your human firewall. And so organizations really need to, spend time and, turning their end users into human firewalls. And so those are the kinds of things that, that I wanted to talk to about slipping through the cracks.
Okay, great. And just a final comment on that. There's a software company out there, Tableau, that makes great self-service analytic tools. And, we see this all the time where people are doing extracts or exports from the corporate database that has all types of controls on it, but all of a sudden, the file is downloaded to another application and all the controls disappear. But the sensitivity and proprietary nature of that data hasn't changed. So the end user element of this and the awareness is key so that people understand what's actually happening when they're doing these exports. Dave, you want to comment on the next two slides in terms of controls and regulatory impact?
Yeah, so EUC controls, right? When we talk about, it really comes down to establish and operationalize labeling, classification, and handling, right? If end users need to understand how they need to label information based on certain criteria, they need to understand how it needs to be classified based on certain criteria, the sensitivity of the information, and they need to understand how they handle it, okay? And so all of those things, handling, whether they're transferring it or how they're storing it, all those kinds of things. And so it really comes down to, end users understanding and having a policy that is easily communicated to the end users regarding labeling, classification, and handling. All right. Then they need to really have establish a clear, very clear on if you're exporting information out of corporate business systems, or you're copying it, or you're storing it. You have to have really clear rules around how it can be stored and how it needs to be labeled and classified. Right. And then wherever you can, right, your final gate would be making sure you have technology and implement some technology, on the high-risk end-user files. All right, there's tools out there that allow you to identify where these high-risk files are, and make sure that those tools are used so you can know where they are, and put the proper technological controls potentially about them as well. All right, next slide. So this slide was in the context, the whole presentation was in the context of GDPR. So we wanted to make sure, right, it really comes down to, there's a couple different strategies when I work with organizations, and, number one, they need to understand what is our exposure to GDPR, right? So it's really about, well, how much, EU citizen information do you have, whether it's in your sales and operations part of it, or whether they're employees, or those kinds of things. And so it really comes down to, making sure organizations understand what their exposure is. Some organizations are taking the path that, you know what, we're gonna do, make procedures and policies based on GDPR, whether they're U.S. citizens or EU citizens, and so some organizations have taken that tack, or some are taking a wait and see approach, right? It goes back to, everyone remembers Y2K and those kind of things, and all the excitement that happened around there. I think this is gonna, the GDPR thing and privacy is going to be long lasting, and it's going to be more prevalent, and reason being is Facebook, right? Everyone's aware of the Facebook privacy issues, and so I would base, if you test the winds of change, that Facebook's challenges with privacy would very easily make it so that within the U.S. a GDPR-like regulation could become realized in the not too near future, and so it's important to be abreast of all of these different dynamics that are happening, right? GDPR is leading from Europe, the issues with Facebook, and GDPR, being in place. It only makes sense that if we're trying to curb some of the privacy issues within the states, there may be something. We're not sure what it will be, but I think it's a pretty good odds that in the not too distant future there'll be some sort of regulation, based on the output from Facebook. Anything else you wanted to add in there, Craig?
No, I'm
okay.
I'm good. Can we sum up on people's process and technology?
Yeah. So when it comes down to risk mitigation, it all comes, it does. It's people, process, technology. Most organizations have fantastic technology. There's technology to identify risky files, and CIMCON and others have those kinds of technology. There's processes on how, most importantly, processes usually as far as handling. When you need to handle sensitive information and end users need to handle it, they need to understand how they need to handle it, how it can be transferred, how it can be stored, right? And then people, they can be the weakest or they can be the strongest link. It's up to the organization and how well they train their people on information security awareness. And so I've seen it. I've been involved with organizations, where the people have been, go through regular training, go through, regular fish testing, and you see that the awareness of the end user becomes that much more aware, and the questions that come in from end users. And so it really does come down to making sure that the end users are trained on the classification, labeling, and handling of their files. And there's only so much you can do with technology and process, but you have to really make it come down to the actual end user.
Okay, great.
Yep.
So again, as Dave and I alluded to, Dave from the people aspect of the process, and when I was describing some of the kind of characteristic behavior that comes from the line of business, if you don't have these types of controls in place and you want to take, a few initial steps toward having some degree of governance over these files, you can expect resistance from the line of business, both from the end users themselves who can't understand why anybody is asking them about controls on files that they own, and then even from management, in terms of maybe it's a cost concern or, why this, why now, why should we do this now? It's really important that if you're in a risk function, some type of governance function, that you add value. The things that are valuable to risk and audit professionals, documentation being one example, often don't have a lot of value to the line of business. That doesn't necessarily reduce their error, or the benefits of that are often indirect and not visible. So you've got to be sure that, your efforts are put forth in a balanced way. We see this over and over where, kind of the policy and procedure just goes over the top, and then there's a negative reaction, and nothing changes and nothing improves. So the rule there, don't forget what's in it for them, and them are the end users. So, human error is the #1 cause of spreadsheet. Human error, i.e. inadvertent errors, are the #1 cause of the disclosure of sensitive information through end-user controlled files. How can you help? How can your risk program or your compliance regime help without really increasing the burden on the line of business? I can't emphasize enough how that you have to have some degree of balance. So if you're a company today that has nothing, i.e., every company has resource limitations. EUC Risk has been around for a long time. It's sometimes ignored or overlooked. But if you have no controls in place, you're vulnerable. You're vulnerable to errors, data loss, lesser extent fraud, and then EUCs are a very soft target for hackers. And to the degree that that file has sensitive information about employees or customers, or it has proprietary information in terms of trading algorithms or financial models, you're vulnerable and need to take steps to start to remedy that. So a couple suggestions on challenges to the first line. Just in terms of an inventory, do you know what critical business processes have a dependency on an end-user controlled file? It's a pretty basic question. If the answer is yes, who's the owner, who's accountable? Are there any controls today? In most companies, they're not. There are hardly any controls on end-user files. Larger companies, especially larger companies in finance, they have some controls, and usually an adequate amount. They're effective, but other companies, no. And then think about your message, right? Here's how things could go wrong. Here's how this could affect you, your career, or the company. Or you can come at them with the compliance stick, and I would argue that the former gets better results than the latter. The last slide here before we transition to questions. From an information risk management perspective, whatever risk assessment frameworks that you have in place for information security, whether they're the NIST framework or ISO 27K, you should make sure that EUC Risk is part of that assessment. Again, it's often overlooked. It's kind of in the back of people's mind, and they don't really think about it because the risk is so omnipresent. But it's there, and it should be, a conscious part of those types of assessments. If you don't have controls today, and the prospect of getting a control set or framework in place is daunting, I just say that some controls are better than none. Pick a starting point and start the journey. This is probably the third time I've mentioned it in the last 5 minutes, but I can't emphasize enough the need for balance between all 3 lines of defense. And then the final point is in terms of technology. and automated reporting on compliance. They can help close the resource gap, improve the productivity not only of the end users in the line of business, but also the risk people and the audit people, and the processes that they're responsible for faithfully executing. So with that, we'll move on to questions. First question is, how can data be classified and labeled when it's exported from an enterprise system? So, there's a couple options there. So if you did an extract into an Excel file, there are tools to provide data classification of Microsoft Office files. So Bolden James is one company that provides those. Titus is another. If you were using a cloud platform, as Dave mentioned, upon import of that file into the cloud, the user can be prompted to classify the data. So there's a number of ways that it can be done, but essentially the export itself isn't the point at which it's classified. It's the point that you now have it in an end user file and you're going to save that end user file. That's the point at which it gets classified, either native to the file itself or upon upload into the cloud. There was a question about the issue that we highlighted in terms of if you choose to move some critical files to a select number of folders in the cloud, there's the risk of breaking links. And the question is, if you move both links, if you move 2 or 3 files that were interconnected, if you move them en masse to the cloud, would the links still break? And the answer is yes. The mechanism by which the enterprise cloud platforms reference other files is radically different than what happens on your desktop or on your network file share. So if you move things to the cloud and they are interconnected, you're going to need to do some work to ensure that those connections are in place and valid. And again, there's tools to help with that. But once you've done that, you're then in a position to essentially reap all of the benefits that are associated with cloud storage. We had one quick question about GDPR. So that stands for the Global Data Protection Regulation. It's out of Europe. And it provides for very, very stiff penalties, up to 4% of a company's revenue, if you don't take adequate steps to control the personal information of your customers. So it's a European regulation, but if you're a U.S. company and you have data on EU citizens, then you're subject to the penalties of noncompliance. There's a question about on one of the slides we made a point about uniform password protection, and you're correct in that I did skip over that. Again, the context of that bullet point was in regards to utilizing automation to get compliance at scale. And so for that particular topic or item of passwords, you can imagine in a large company, you might have a policy that says any file that has sensitive customer information needs to have a password. But there really is no way of enforcing that. How do you go and check 10,000 files to see that they have passwords? Or how do you ensure that the password isn't 123? Or how do you ensure that a group within finance who prepares a weekly report on reconciliation and they all share the password for a single file and take turns updating the data? So that's really hard to do manually, but the point we were trying to make is passwords and password enforcement is one of the things that can be done at scale with the assistance of technology. We have another question about, if one relates to DLP, we already have DLP to track data at rest and in motion. What's the significance of data classification software? So the short answer is DLP won't work without data classification. So DLP, data loss prevention technology, requires a tag to understand whether a file is sensitive or not. So if you've got DLP, you've already got data classification. So your focus should then be looking at, well, are we applying the classification in a consistent way across all our storage platforms, both in the cloud as well as in network. But if you've already got DLP, then you're already going down the road in regards to data classification. And, from Dave and my perspective, we'd give you a well done and say, keep up the good work. Another question on GDPR, does it affect companies outside the EU? So it affects, and Dave, correct me if I'm wrong here, but GDPR affects any company anywhere in the world that handles personal information of EU citizens. Do I have that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, it's yet to be determined who the authorities in those countries would be to enforce it, but GDPR is put in place to protect the privacy of EU citizens. Yep.
Another question here. It doesn't look like we'll get to all of them in the time frame here, Lucy, but we'll keep going through it. There's a question about what tools are available for file sharing to prevent inappropriate copying and sharing of files. So there's lots of ways to do that. The technology of companies like CIMCON can help with that, but I would actually argue that the best way to do that is to leverage the controls that exist in cloud platforms like Box or Dropbox. So that entire genre isn't the right word, but that entire space of enterprise content management is built around more efficient sharing and collaboration of files across employees in different departments and different locations. But, hand in hand with that, you have to have the appropriate controls in regards to copying and sharing. And those platforms can provide that natively. And then in addition, as part of the control framework that you would get from CIMCON or one of our competitors, you can put those types of controls in place as well. Question on how to control files in email archives and storage. So, that's possible. It really, if you decide this is a critical file and we choose to put controls on that file, it doesn't matter where the file sits or is located, whether it's in active storage or some kind of archive. The one thing that I'll say is, as part of the control process, you actually access the file. So there's an issue there that the control process itself might rehydrate the file and bring it out of archive. So there's some nuance to controlling a business-critical file that's been archived, but there are ways to do it. It just, how to do that kind of exceeds the scope of this call. So with that, Lucy, I think we're at 61 minutes, so we should probably wrap up. We apologize if we didn't get to your questions. Dave and my contact information is available on the slides and on a PDF that was available as part of this presentation, and you're more than welcome to contact us with any follow-up questions.
Thank you so much, Craig. I appreciate that. Okay, everyone, it looks like we are out of time for today, so I'd like to thank Craig and Dave for that great presentation and that very interesting Q&A session. Also, a big thank you to our sponsor, CIMCON, whose support has made it possible for ISACA to offer this event free of charge to our constituents. Remember to check out the tabs at the top of the presentation window to view additional resources. There is a PDF with CIMCON information that does have Dave and Craig's email. As well, if you are in the Papers tab, click on the icon at the end of the title and that will pull up the PDF if you're having trouble. This webinar was recorded, so you can go back and watch it from the on-demand program section within your classroom in the My Learning portal. If you are interested in earning up to 5 CPE credits with no travel, register for the June 26th virtual summit, the State of Cybersecurity Now. Click on the link in the announcements window to the left to learn more. Again, I'd like to thank our sponsor, CIMCON, and our speakers for their time and their expertise today, along with everyone in our live audience for your attention and participation. Please have a great rest of your day.